I paid for my mother-in-law's 50th birthday party while her children did nothing. However, at the last minute, she forbade me from attending. So I canceled everything and now she's crying. I'm 26 years old, female, and have been married to my 29-year-old husband for almost 3 years. I always knew his family didn't really like me. My husband has 2 younger twin sisters, 23, and a younger brother, 21. None of them seem to like me much. The same goes for my mother-in-law. I never managed to understand exactly why they didn't like me. But I was determined to fix it. After all, I wanted to build a good relationship with my in-laws. So, I decided to organize my mother-in-law's 50th birthday party this year. My husband advised me not to. According to him, if his family didn't seem to like me, then I should just leave it alone instead of trying so hard to please them and earn their affection. But I ignored him since I really wanted to get along with them. I'm a sociable person, and I couldn't stand the idea that these people seemed to detest me for no apparent reason. I felt I had to remedy it. So, a few days ago I started planning the party. I even tried to involve my husband's siblings, but they weren't interested at all. They simply told me to do it myself if I wanted to so badly. I booked one of my mother-in-law's favorite restaurants where she used to go on dates with her late husband. I paid for all the food and decorations well in advance. I also personally supervised everything to make sure it was all according to her tastes and standards since she's very particular about those details. I also invited some of her closest friends and some relatives, previously consulting with my husband about who she would like to have present. Basically, I paid for everything and planned it on my own with a little help from him. Meanwhile, her own children did absolutely nothing to help or contribute financially. Yesterday, on the eve of her birthday, we went to visit her, although my husband didn't want to. When we arrived, we noticed that her other children were already there. They seemed quite surprised to see us, but they didn't say anything. After a bit of small talk, I finally got to the point. I told her that we would wait for her at the restaurant the next afternoon since we had planned something for her. She smiled and thanked my husband for it. However, he clarified that it had all been my idea and that she should thank me. Her face instantly darkened, and for a second I felt quite confused. I explained that I had invited all her close friends and some of her relatives. I also told her that I had made sure to choose all her favorite foods, trying to get her to acknowledge my efforts. But then, an unpleasant expression took over her face. She proceeded to thank me in the fakest, most saccharine tone I've ever heard before, telling me that although she appreciated my efforts, she regretted to inform me that she would not be able to attend. I was stunned and asked her why, to which she replied that she wanted her 50th birthday to be special, so she wanted it to be a family-only event. And although she considered her friends as family, she did not consider me part of it at all. Therefore, she would appreciate it if I did not show up. My husband and I were completely shocked. At that moment, I understood that he had been right from the beginning, and that I should never have tried so hard since she was clearly never going to value anything I did. On the other hand, my husband's siblings seemed about to burst out laughing at any moment. That's what angered me even more. Completely indignant, I stood up and told her she could go to hell. I also warned her that if she dared to show up the next day, I would have security escort her out of the place. That wiped the arrogant smiles off their faces. My annoyed mother-in-law told me I was being cold and cruel. I simply laughed in her face and replied that it was quite ironic coming from her. After a brief discussion in which she tried to convince me that I was wrong, I told her that she didn't deserve anything good and that my decision was final. She and her children were furious. Just before I left, my mother-in-law started crying, probably as a last attempt to make me feel guilty, but I didn't care anymore. I was furious. On the way home, I tried to cancel the reservation, but since it was too late, there was nothing I could do. My husband seemed quite uncomfortable with the whole situation but refused to comment. He just said I had done the right thing and then went out for a smoke when we got home, which I thought was fine. After all, he had never been very expressive when it came to his family and preferred to stay out of these things. Besides, I had been the one who ignored his advice, so it was nice of him not to throw it in my face. Anyway, since I had already paid for the venue and the food, I decided to cancel all the invitations. It was quite last minute and annoyed many of the guests, but since they were mostly my mother-in-law's friends, I didn't care. I called some of my own friends so that at least it would be worth it since I was pretty upset about everything that had happened. My husband also joined in. I also managed to convince him to invite some of his friends so we could celebrate. We removed the decorations just in time, barely a few minutes before they arrived. Despite everything, we had a great time. It was an incredible night. After returning home today, my sister-in-law sent me a message saying that I had ruined her mother's birthday. She also indignantly added that it had been incredibly selfish of me to use the venue for myself, especially knowing how much it meant to my mother-in-law. The truth is, I don't feel particularly guilty about what I did. I think it was perfectly reasonable, although I just really hope I'm right. I told my husband about the message his sister had sent me and asked him if I should apologize to his family, but he told me definitely not. In fact, he told me he was fed up with their behavior and that it would be best to cut ties with them. It would mean that his mother would have to depend on her other children instead. And that was precisely the problem because my husband's siblings were good for nothing and changed jobs every few months. Truth be told, they all depended heavily on him for money and other things, so this was a very important decision. I tried to change his mind, but he wouldn't budge. I'm completely convinced there's something important he's not telling me. The truth is, I always noticed that his family drifted away from him as our relationship progressed. By the time we got married, he was already quite distant from them. It wasn't his fault. I remember him telling me on several occasions that he had invited his family to dinner while we were dating and even during the early stages of our marriage, but they always made some excuse not to come. I'm sure that I was also partly one of the reasons for that estrangement. That was another reason that made me feel so desperate to build a good relationship with my in-laws so that my husband could also reconnect with them. That's why I'm determined to get to the bottom of this matter. I don't want my husband to be unhappy because of me, and to hold a grudge against me in the future. I just hope that when he finally feels comfortable enough, he'll have the courage to tell me what really led him to make such a drastic decision. After much insistence, my husband finally opened up to me about why he decided to cut off all relations with his family after so many years. I already knew that his father had passed away when he was 21 and that back then, his siblings were still in school. At that time, his mother had never worked a single day in her life, so naturally, he had to start working and become the family's breadwinner since the money his father had left wouldn't be enough to cover all the expenses. He worked hard day and night. Finally, when he was around 23, he found some investors for his startup. From that moment on, things finally started to improve for him. He went from barely surviving to thriving. That was great for him, but for his family it was another story. They became incredibly lazy and materialistic. Now that he was earning more money, they started to depend on him more and more. However, he didn't say anything. He didn't complain or object. He felt it was his duty to do so, believing that was what his father would have wanted him to do. Besides, his family always treated his girlfriends very badly. They believed that having other people in his life would distract him from what they thought should be his only priority: supporting his family. So when we met, and it became clear that I wasn't someone they could simply mistreat and push away, since I was determined to be with my husband, they started to get annoyed by my mere presence. Since then, they tried to turn him against me. However, by then he was already fed up. There were many arguments and fights between them during the time we were dating, things that happened behind my back since his family wanted him to break up with me, but he was determined to marry me. Eventually, his family began to distance themselves from him, as a way to emotionally manipulate him into feeling guilty. Despite that, they still turned to him for money. That tactic also failed, and several years later, here we are, still together and stronger than ever. After the whole birthday disaster, my husband told me that while his sister had sent me that message to make me feel guilty, his mother had called him to do exactly the same thing. She tried to emotionally manipulate him into leaving me, arguing that I had insulted her. That was the last straw for him. That's when he decided he'd had enough and that it was time to cut ties with them. I'm still in shock. I can't believe everything his family put him through, even though he was the one who had been supporting them all this time. I honestly don't have an ounce of respect left for them because they're simply greedy and selfish. I'm really happy that I stood firm with my husband despite his family's attempts to separate us and drive me away from him just so they could keep his money. The truth is, I don't care how much money he has because I love him for who he is, and his bank account has nothing to do with it. Now that I know the whole truth, I'm surprised he was able to put up with all this. And even though he knew I wanted to have a good relationship with my in-laws, he also knew that was never going to happen. I think he's making the right decision now. His family deserves to be cut out of our lives. They're incredibly selfish and greedy. They don't have an ounce of respect for the only man who was always there for them, through thick and thin, and frankly, they don't deserve anything more from him. Today my husband finally called his mother and told her he didn't want to hear from her or his siblings unless they changed their attitude. He also made it clear that they would have to find their own means of support, because he wasn't going to keep supporting them for the rest of their lives. As expected, this decision was met with outrage from his family. I could hear my mother-in-law yelling at my husband, even though his phone wasn't even on speakerphone. There was a rather unpleasant argument between them, and since I was in the same room as my husband, I heard every word that was said. Of course, my mother-in-law tried to blame me for everything. She said that I had surely manipulated him somehow into making the decision to push them away. She also accused me of trying to break up the family, and told my husband that he shouldn't let himself be manipulated by his wife. Again, the irony of her asking my husband not to be manipulated struck me as quite funny. Of course, my husband didn't remain silent and defended me as best he could. He even told her that his siblings should find decent jobs because they were all adults now, and it was pretty pathetic that they still depended on him for support. My mother-in-law then started accusing my husband of letting himself be carried away by money and the power his supposedly well-paid job gave him. She also insinuated that I was surely encouraging him to cut ties with them, which was why, according to her, he was treating his own blood so cruelly. It was the typical emotional manipulation attempt she had always used to keep him under her control. But this time I wasn't going to let that happen again. Not after knowing everything she and her other children had been doing behind his back. I wasn't going to let them keep playing him. When the argument started to get too heated, and I saw my husband getting frustrated, his eyes filled with tears of pure helplessness, I decided to intervene. I told my mother-in-law that my husband's decision was already made. I warned her that if she and her children didn't start behaving soon, then they would lose my husband's support forever. Now the decision was in their hands. They could start behaving like decent people, respect both my husband and me, and remain a part of our lives, or they could continue being the same greedy, materialistic parasites they had been so far and be completely cut out of my husband's life. With that said, I hung up the call and silenced all notifications on my husband's phone, so he wouldn't have to keep dealing with them for a while, and could calm down. It's been an hour since the call ended. We've put our phones aside, and now we're watching a movie to distract ourselves for now. But honestly, I think the worst is over this time. As if bothering my husband and ruining his day wasn't enough, my mother-in-law decided to bother me too. After the movie ended, my husband decided to catch up on some pending work, and I took the opportunity to check my phone. I had several missed calls from my mother-in-law and countless messages full of horrible words written by my husband's siblings. The messages were full of insults and vulgar words. But honestly, I wasn't surprised at all. It was just what I expected, and frankly, how predictable. I simply took screenshots of everything for evidence later on. After that, I ignored it. I continued answering some work emails for the next 10 minutes. That's when my mother-in-law called again. I accidentally ended up accepting the call. As soon as I answered, she started saying the most unpleasant things imaginable about me and my upbringing. She called me self-serving, manipulative, and selfish, claiming I was only with my husband to ruin him. I didn't respond to any of her accusations. I just waited silently for her to finish venting. When she finally seemed to run out of steam, I simply looked at her, even though she couldn't see me, and I said that everything she had accused me of was actually what she herself had been doing. I told her that before pointing fingers at others, maybe she should start by looking at herself and reflecting a little. I also told her that I was glad my husband was finally getting rid of parasites like her and her other children because frankly they didn't deserve to even breathe the same air as him. After that, I hung up and without a second thought blocked her and my husband's siblings on every platform possible so they couldn't contact me again. It's sad to see how far people will go just to avoid having to work and earn a living for themselves. I haven't told my husband that his mother called me because I don't want to stress him out more than he already is, but if this happens again, then I will definitely tell him. And this time I'll make sure we get them out of our lives for good. They have absolutely no right to disturb our peace like this. I don't know what they're going to do now, but I'm sure my mother-in-law won't stop until we decide to take legal action against her or something. I pray we don't have to go to that extreme because it would be very hard on my husband emotionally. But if it comes to that, I'm more than willing to make sure we see it through to the end because I'm not going to let anyone, and I mean anyone, hurt him again. For him, for us, I'm not going to let them keep messing with my husband. It's over. Did you hear me? It's over. Almost 2 weeks have passed since I last shared anything, and a lot has happened since then. After I blocked my mother-in-law, my husband and I had dinner and went to sleep, hoping to enjoy some peace and quiet the next day. But to our surprise, the very next day, my mother-in-law showed up at our door along with her 3 adult children, demanding an explanation for everything that had happened so far. They looked quite angry, and I knew this was going to be very stressful for my husband. I decided to stay in the room despite their complaints that I had no right to be there because, according to them, this was a family matter, and I wasn't part of the family. I made it clear that they were invading my privacy and that being under my roof, they had no right to tell me whether I could stay or not. Then they started verbally attacking my husband, throwing all sorts of accusations at him. That he was selfish, that he was being unfair, and they even went so far as to say that he was abandoning his own family just to keep his wife happy. My husband remained silent, his face already quite red. So I knew that was the moment I had to intervene. You see, my husband is a very sensitive man, especially when it comes to his family and the people he loves. I knew he wouldn't be able to defend himself against their false accusations and manipulations because he's that kind and noble. And while they were just using him for his money, he truly loved his family. So I told him to calm down and then asked them to leave. They were getting on my last nerve, but the most important thing was that they were making my husband cry. My mother-in-law started arguing with me, saying that I couldn't kick her out, especially because it was her son's house, and she could stay there as long as she wanted. Even though my husband was already visibly upset with everything that was going on, she kept pushing him. It was disgusting to see how little she cared about her own son's feelings. The only thing she really cared about was money. At that moment, I couldn't take it anymore. I lost my patience. I yelled at them exactly what I thought of them all, that they were a bunch of useless loafers who were only living thanks to my husband's kindness and generosity because they were incapable of doing anything for themselves. I told them that if anyone was a gold digger, it was them. Not only had they always been lurking around my husband to get money, but they also had the nerve to be so ungrateful and attack him after everything he had done for them. They fell completely silent, clearly not knowing how to respond. Taking advantage of the fact that they had nothing more to say, I told them to leave before I called the police for showing up uninvited and refusing to leave. They finally left. After my husband calmed down, I told him it was time to look for lawyers, and thank goodness we did because just a few days later, my mother-in-law sent us a legal notification demanding that my husband pay them an exorbitant sum of money as compensation. It was disgusting that they had the nerve to make up such a lie. Luckily, we were able to prove that it was all false. The last I heard, my mother-in-law and her children were rejected by the rest of the family. We can finally put all this drama behind us and forget about them once and for all. My husband and I are much happier now, and I intend to make sure things stay that way forever. No one, absolutely no one, will ever interfere in our lives again.